and welcome back to my biblical book review where we will continue reading and analyzing the book of Genesis. Now, for anybody who wanted to follow along, please turn to chapter 12, verse 2, where it talks about Abram. We will be starting with a new story in the Bible that follows Abram and Lot, as well as Abram's wife will be a major player in this. And basically it starts out with God blessing Abram, telling him that anyone who blesses Abram shall be blessed by God, and anyone who curses Abram shall be cursed by God. And that seemed okay until you get into the story and he decides to travel to Egypt. Now, he's very fearful because apparently Abram's wife is extremely beautiful, and he's worried that basically the Egyptians will murder him so they can marry his wife. So when he reaches Egypt, he lies and says she's his sister. Well, apparently the Pharaoh is very enchanted by her beauty, and he decides to marry her. There doesn't seem to be a lot of asking to marry in this book, but anyway, he gives Abram the dowry and marries Sarai, and so God, who apparently doesn't even take into account that the Pharaoh wasn't trying to wrong Abram, curses him with serious diseases on the Pharaoh and his household. The Pharaoh finds out why he's cursed. He goes to Abram and is like, hey, why'd you say she was your sister? And Abram's like, oh, I thought everyone would murder me to marry her. Well, it doesn't seem to be the case, because the Pharaoh just brings Sarai back, and Abram and his wife are able to go on their way without any issue. It just doesn't seem like the Pharaoh was ever going to do anything like he assumed, and apparently he was just being paranoid. And apparently God doesn't even take things like that into consideration once you have his blessing. Then we jump to Lot, because Abram and his Lot separated, went their separate ways, and Lot went on his way to go to Sodom and Gomorrah. And apparently it emphasizes that everyone in this land is wicked except for Lot and his family, which seems to be a trope that comes up a lot in this book. You saw it with Noah, where it's like the only good man in the entire world is Noah. And now it's the only good man in all of Sodom and Gomorrah is Lot. Which, again, I just don't really find that realistic, because you don't really... Again, you see a lot of people who are bad people in a particular region, but you don't really see it like everyone. But then we go back to Abram. We're jumping back and forth between the two brothers, and Abram's apparently having some difficulty having a son. So Sarai decides to have him impregnate her slave without her slave's consent. I'd use a different word there, but I've heard YouTube really doesn't like that word. But yeah, understandably. And I would also like to note that I know we've already established that God doesn't care if Abram lies to have someone accidentally wrong him, but apparently he doesn't even care if Abram's a good person. Once you got his blessing, you got his blessing. So anyway, Abram does impregnate his wife's slave, who is understandably upset about this and starts to dislike Sarai for understandable reasons. And Sarai's like, what should I do? My slave hates me now. And Abram's like, do with her what you will. She's your slave. And so she starts abusing her slave, who already had a really, really terrible deal. So her slave understandably runs away. Now, an angel then goes to the slave and says, "Oh, you should go back. And I promise you, if you go back, your descendants will be more numerous than you can count." Which, when she's not even happy about being impregnated the one time, I really can't see why she'd be excited about hearing that it was going to happen a bunch more times. But apparently she is okay with this deal because she goes back to being a slave under an abusive owner. This book really doesn't have a lot of moments that really make you feel good about what's going on, does it? Anyway, then God decides to make a covenant with Abram. Apparently, he is also being offered more descendants than can be counted. Apparently, this is just God's thing. If he wants to do something nice for you, he just thinks the best thing is to have lots of descendants, because he's just handing that out like candy. But he says, you'll have to do something in return for me if you want all of these descendants. You're gonna have to cut off part of your dick. And everyone in your household who has a dick will also have to cut off part of their dicks. I just wonder if at this point God's just saying, like, how much could I get him to do that he'll actually do? Because I just don't see any benefit to God to circumcising yourself. I don't know why he's asking this. So I'm guessing God just wants to see, will he do it? Well, guess what? He does it. He does it on his sons. He does it with every male in his household. And from here on out, every male in this family line gets circumcised. So apparently, the limit has not been reached. Anyway, then we kind of have a call out to what's going on with Lot. As we already established, he had gone to Sodom and Gomorrah. And God says, well, the lands of Sodom and Gomorrah have grown so wicked, I'm just going to destroy them both and everyone in them. And Abraham, I'm guessing he knows that's where his brother was going, pleads for the place, or he just doesn't like genocide. That's a good reason too. No one likes genocide except apparently God in this book does a whole lot. But anyway, Abraham's like, well, what if there's some people who are virtuous over there? And eventually he gets God to agree that if there's even 10 virtuous men in the lands of Sodom and Gomorrah, he will spare it. And so he sends his angels to see if there is anyone virtuous there. So the angels show up, they stay with Lot, and all the men in the area apparently start banging on the door because they want Lot to send the angels out so they can forcefully penetrate them without their consent. And Lot does say no, which is the correct answer. I would be boarding up my doors and windows. But then he says something else, which is a lot more disturbing. He says that, look, I have 2 daughters who have never slept with a man. Let me bring them out to you and you can do what you like with them. And that is, twisted. Anyway, if I was the angels, I probably at this point would be like, nope, no one virtuous here, burn it all. But apparently they deem this to be a virtuous act, and they decide to save Lot and his daughters by telling him to take his daughters and flee the area. I'm really not seeing how Lot's virtuous, but okay. So Lot basically takes his daughters, his wife. He tries to get his sons-in-law to come as well, but when he tells them what's happening, they don't believe him. They don't come with him. So they all flee. The angels apparently informed them that the town of Zor will be safe. So, yeah, they're all headed to the next town over, the town of Zor. And that's what makes this next part so unrealistic. They're on the way to this town, and because there's no other men around, and as is the custom all over the earth, they want to have children, they decide to sleep with their father while he's asleep, like literally. And I don't know, like, the reasoning they give for them doing this, they both get impregnated, but the reason they give for them doing this is because they want to continue the family line, and it's the custom for women to have babies. But, like, couldn't they just wait till they get to town? Which they're on their way to already? I don't even get what the reasoning was supposed to be there, but that's just bizarre. Then we get to the next story where Abraham, oh, by the way, God decided to rename Abram to Abraham and Sarai to Sarah. I actually noticed, we haven't gotten to it, but there's several points in this book where God just likes to rename people. I guess it's just a thing he does. But basically it's the same story with Abraham and the Pharaoh again. He goes to Egypt and lies about who his wife is. Oh, this one's a little nicer. God just curses the Pharaoh with infertility. Either the Pharaoh is the most gullible man in the world, and Abraham just cannot get over his thought that people in Egypt will murder him and marry his wife, or this might just be a retelling. I am aware there are a lot of points in this book where they just retell the exact same story again and again and again, so I'm guessing that's what's going on here. Then after this, you have a story of Abraham getting tested by God, and I don't know if God's just like pushing things even further, like, hey, he cut off part of his dick, how far can we go? But this test is the most twisted and disturbing test. Basically, he tells Abraham, hey, you know Isaac, that son that you love? Sacrifice him to me as a burnt offering. Now, I would think that the proper answer to that would be, no, go fuck yourself. But apparently, Abraham's like, okay. Apparently he will do, like, literally anything God says. So he takes Isaac up to the mountain to go sacrifice him and ties him up. Then God's like, woo, you passed the test. That you don't have to actually do that. Here's a sheep to sacrifice to me. Which I am, don't get me wrong, I am glad that God wasn't evil enough to actually have him sacrifice his son. But that's just creepy to have that be the passing conditions. Because I feel like the answer should be no there. But then this is not a loving God. This is a very insecure God that's constantly needing people to reaffirm everything for him. Like, hey, do you love me? Do you still love me? Do you love me more than him? Do you love me more than your son? And so it actually does make sense for the character, but yeah, it really does not put Abraham in a very good light that he was willing to say yes. But anyway, God says, you were willing to kill him, so yeah, well, make your children more numerous than the... Didn't he already promise that? Like, he already promised that for cutting off part of his dick. Why does he have to pass more tests to get what he was already promised? Apparently, God is so stuck on that being, like, the reward he gives out that even if he's already promised you that, instead of coming up with, like, a new reward for the new test you passed, he just says, yeah, now I'll definitely do that one thing I promised you. So, yeah, that was Isaac and Abraham. And I bet the relationship between Isaac and his father had to have been messed up for the rest of his life, because I really can't see still feeling as close to your father after you know how easy it is to get your father to murder you. And then they tell the story of Abraham and the Pharaoh yet again, only this time it's Isaac. So again, either it just runs in your family, lying about whether someone's your wife or your sister, or they're telling the story again, and apparently when they were compiling this book, there was some disagreement over whether the person who had the encounter with the Pharaoh should be Isaac or Abraham, and so they said, hey, let's just put both stories in and have it be both. And then Isaac goes on to have two sons, Jacob and Esau, and Jacob is very much the cheat you out of everything you have type, and he cheats his brother out of his inheritance by basically taking advantage of him while he's starving, and he cheats his brother out of the blessing that Isaac, because this is a blessing that basically they did establish, because the blessing went from Abraham to Isaac. I'm guessing this was his way of making up for attempting to murder him as a kid. But anyway, the blessing, Abraham gave Isaac his blessing, and that basically gives the God will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. And then when Isaac grew old, he wanted to give the blessing to Esau, which is who I'd give it to because that's the honest brother. But basically because his father was old and blind and confused, Jacob was able to trick him into giving him the blessing instead. And apparently God not only doesn't care what kind of person you are when you have his blessing, he also doesn't care how you get it. If you lie, cheat, and steal to get the blessing, as long as the words are said, you're the one who gets the magic God powers. So, yeah, he goes on to work with a man who's also kind of like him, the lying, cheating wheeler dealer, and when he starts working for his employer, he's actually in love with his employer's younger daughter, and his employer agrees to let him marry her if he works for him for 7 years. He works for him for 7 years, but his older daughter is still single. He doesn't want his older daughter to watch the younger daughter get married while she's still single, and so he just straight up tricks Jacob into marrying the other daughter. And Jacob's like, when he pulls back the veil, is like, hey, wait a minute, this is the wrong person. So his employer says, well, work for me for another 7 years and you'll get to marry the person you actually wanted to marry the first time around. So he agrees to it, works for him for another 7 years. After that, of course, they have to resort what his wages will be. So he says, let me go through all your flocks today and remove them from them every speckled or spotted sheep, every dark-colored lamb, every spotted or speckled goat. They will be my wages. So anyway, he agrees to those wages, and in a show that whoever wrote this didn't understand genetics, Jacob basically takes a bunch of sticks and he strips them so they'll be striped, and puts them in the watering trough of all the healthiest sheeps and goats, so that way all their offspring will also be striped. So apparently they understood genetics to know that, hey, 2 healthy sheep make another healthy sheep most of the time, but didn't understand, like, yeah, that works with coloration too. Seeing striped sticks will not change the color of your offspring. So anyway, he just keeps doing this until all the healthy sheep and goats belong to him, and then he decides to move on. And so the next part, basically, Jacob has a whole bunch of sons and 1 daughter. And then Dinah, the 1 daughter, is, well, I can't use the R word on YouTube, so I'll just say forcefully penetrated without her consent by someone named Shechem. And Shechem then shows up with his father going like, oh, he likes her so much, and he really found her delightful, which is so disturbing considering the interaction he had with her. And I was really worried about how this was going to go, considering the previous story with Lot and everything. But I was actually pleasantly surprised. But basically, he's like, oh, he's so in love with her, which I have my doubts. You wouldn't do that to someone you were in love with. And like, oh, he'll pay the bridegroom price, yada yada. So her brothers, Simeon and Levi, decide to trick him and be like, well, all the men in your family will have to be circumcised if you want to marry her. So basically they do that, and while they're still in pain from circumcision, they murder all the men in the family, which might be a little excessive. Okay, it's definitely excessive. I would have just murdered Shechem and his father, although considering Shechem's father's reaction to knowing what his son did, I doubt there were any men in that family that were much better. The fact that he didn't even think he'd be in trouble for it makes me think that a lot of people in the circle were like that, so I don't feel too bad. But then I am a little concerned when it says they carried off their wealth and all their women and children. I'm kind of worried about what happened with that. But I'm just gonna not focus on that because this story has been just so dark so far. Anyway, Jacob's furious when he finds out what they did, saying, oh, you're making us obnoxious to them. Whatever. But I like their reply. They were like, should he have treated our sister like a prostitute? Granted, you shouldn't do that to a prostitute either without their consent. But, I mean, I like the attitude of, yeah, well, maybe what we did was wrong, but what he did was definitely crossing a line, and as we've seen for how things work in this story, we know no justice would have been served if they hadn't, so it still feels, kind of good, but not if you think of it too much. Anyway, another son of Jacob is named Joseph, and apparently, none of Joseph's brothers like him because he's always having these dreams like, oh, I had a dream you were all bowing to me, which did build up a lot of ill will, although the ill will the brothers show to him is a little bit much. And basically they end up beating him up. They originally want to kill him, but his brother Rueben actually talks him out of killing him and says, hey, just put him in the cistern. And he actually had a plan to loop back, get him out of the cistern and bring him home. But before Rueben was able to do that, his other brother Judah decides to sell Joseph into slavery, and so that's what they end up doing. So when Rueben goes back to save his brother Joseph, he's not there, he was sold into slavery. Then after that, we jump to Judah's story, and he apparently has a son named Er, his firstborn, and he gets a wife for his son, but it says, but Er, Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. It's not even going to say what he did, it just, yeah, he killed him. Moving on. It would make a little more sense what the Lord's motivations were if it would give any detail to that at all, but it doesn't. So then Judah has Onan, the other brother of Er, sleep with Tamar, who was Er's wife, to give her a son that would actually be Er's son, so Er could have an heir. But Onan, knowing that the child would not be his, the child actually would be his, but because the child would be considered his brother's, he didn't want to do it, so he keeps spilling his seed on the ground. Apparently God, remember the guy who originally killed Er, making sure he wouldn't have a child, that same God, because Onan isn't willing to get her pregnant, and he apparently wants to continue that line, decides to kill Onan too. Seriously, if you wanted that line continued, maybe you should have just not killed Er. Anyway, Judah then promises her that when his youngest son, Shelah, grows up, she'll be able to have a child with him. But yeah, and then there's a whole story with that where he's afraid to, so he doesn't actually let her sleep with him. So she tricks Judah into sleeping with her. Yeah. Anyway, that's just weird, but I really do want to focus on the God character, because it is clear that God apparently thinks everyone here is wicked and keeps killing them, and then like, oops. But I mean, it just seems really extreme that God decided to kill Onan for not impregnating a woman. I mean, there have been a lot of people in this story doing far worse things than not impregnating their brother's widow, and none of them get punished for the things they do, and we just have to accept, like, yeah, that's just how it is in this world, where he does something he wouldn't even have to do if God had impulse control. And I don't even know why God cares. Like, why does God care that the lineage of someone he apparently thought was wicked continues or not? But anyway, there's a big long story. Apparently, while this was going on, Joseph became a main advisor to the Pharaoh. He ends up in a huge position to power, and it turns out his dreams of everybody bowing to him came absolutely true. And he's apparently able to speak to God to interpret his dreams. And we're actually to the end of the book now. And then at this part, Jacob is at the end of his life, and he decides to bless his sons. Now, this time, instead of giving all the blessing on one person, he divides it up. But the way he divides it up really doesn't make any sense. Rueben, if you remember, being literally the only sibling who didn't try to get his brother killed or sold into slavery, that Rueben. He says, "Rueben, you are my firstborn, my might, the first sign of my strength, excelling in honor, excelling in power. Turbulent as the waters, you will no longer excel, for you went up onto your father's bed." I don't even know what that means. There was nothing in the story where he did that. "Onto my couch and defiled it." I did not see anywhere in the story where Rueben did anything like that. All he did was try to save his brother's life. But okay, now we go on to Simeon and Levi. The first two people in this book that seem to realize that penetrating a woman without her consent is wrong. They get Simeon and Levi are brothers. Their swords are weapons of violence. Let me not enter their council, which generally I would agree with not entering the council of violent people, but all those brothers, except for Rueben and Joseph, were kind of violent people in this story. I don't really get why they get it that much worse. I mean, maybe it's just that their violence was excessive, because it definitely was. I just don't have a lot of faith in a book that said Lot was the only virtuous man when he was willing to do what he did. Everyone else pretty much gets these praises and blessings, except for Issachar, who has not actually even, he's just one of the anonymous siblings. He has to submit to forced labor. It doesn't say why. He hasn't been named till this point, but apparently, for some reason, he is arbitrarily getting cursed too. Everybody else gets like various blessings based on who they are as a person, although since their characters haven't been developed, we don't really know what that is. And the characters who have been developed, it just seems arbitrary, like Rueben getting cursed despite him being one of the only nice people in that family, and then Simeon and Levi for being excessively violent, which, yeah, they were. But yeah, that was Genesis. It really wasn't what I was expecting from the most popular book of all time. This is an anthology, and that was just the first book, and I'm sure it'll go up from here. So yeah, let's just look forward to Exodus, which we'll be reading next time, and see how that goes. Till next time, bye-bye.